Good afternoon, Atlantic Herring Management Board members. Welcome to the last part of our day. I'm Cherie Patterson, the chairperson, and I would like to call the meeting to order at this point in time. With the board's consent, I would like to approve the agenda. Are there any objections or edits to the agenda? If so, please raise your hand.
I see no objections.
With no objections, the agenda is approved by consent. Thank you. Next, I would like, with the board's approval, to seek consent to approve the proceedings from the October 2020 meeting. Are there any objections or changes to the proceedings? If so, please raise your hand.
I see no objections.
Seeing no objections, the proceedings are approved by consent. Thank you. Next on the agenda, we will be seeking public comment on items not on this agenda. So if any public would like to make any comments, please raise your hand.
I see no hands up for comment.
Okay, thank you, Tony. So the next part of the agenda is setting the sub-annual catch limit for the 2021 through 2023 fishing years. In October, the board set seasonal allocations for the 2020 Area 1A fishery, but the sub-ACL specifications were not available. The New England Fishery Management Council recommended specifications for 2021 through 2023 through Framework 8 to NOAA Fisheries in September of 2020, and those are in your briefing materials. And NOAA is still reviewing Framework 8. Therefore, the proposed rule specifications have not been published yet. A final rule is expected to be published after this board meeting. So I'd like to turn over to, I don't know if it's going to be Emily or Kirby, to go through the sub-annual catch limit for the next 2 years.
Thanks, Cherie. It's Kirby. I'll be giving the presentation.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Chair Patterson. As you just mentioned, I'm going to go through a brief presentation on herring specifications. As you mentioned, I want to give the board warning that this presentation is nearly identical to the information presented at the annual meeting. So if you have a feeling of deja vu, that's why. So next slide, please. So as mentioned, the council approved Framework 8 in September 2020. It contains the 2021 through 2023 specifications. It proposes a lower catch limit for Area 1A sub-ACL for 2021 at 1,391 metric tons. And then for 2022 and 2023, it goes a little bit lower to 1,184 metric tons. So just to understand that we are dealing with a low sub-ACL to begin with, but this is also a reduction from what it was in 2020, approximately a 58% reduction. And the 2023 specs may be revised following the 2022 management track assessment. So as Chair Patterson noted, the Framework 8 is still under review by NOAA Fisheries. We've been in contact with their staff, and they have indicated that they are working hard to get an interim final rule out at some point, but obviously at this point we don't have a proposed rule that's been published yet from them. Just a breakdown on this slide, we have the overfishing limit, acceptable biological catch, management uncertainty, annual catch limit, domestic annual harvest, and border transfer. So the SSC initially considered a higher ABC for 2023 when looking at this table, but ended up recommending that the council maintain the 2022 ABC of 8,767 metric tons as part of the framework. And the council agreed to do so for two primary reasons. The lower ABC helps reduce scientific uncertainty in both the SSC and the council viewed the 2023 ABC as a placeholder. So 2023 specifications will likely be updated as mentioned based on the 2022 management track assessment results. So you can see here the acceptable biological catch in 2021 is 9,438 or 9,483 metric tons, and then for the next 2 years it's set slightly lower at 8,767 metric tons. Under that, you have the management uncertainty that's held static for both 2021 and then the next 2 years at 4,669 metric tons. And in terms of the annual catch limit, which again is subdivided by these different areas, for 2021, that is 4,814 metric tons. And then for 2022 and 23, it's 4,098 metric tons. And it's always good to note that that number can change depending on the New Brunswick weir fishery, and that's dependent on their catch through October 1. So that could be adjusted and more landings can be added to the Area 1A sub ACL depending on how that fishery performs. So getting to specifications by area, in particular, Area 1A sub ACL is 28.9% of that total ACL. As I mentioned in the previous slide, it's a decrease in 2021 and a further decrease the next 2 years. This also includes, in this breakdown, the fixed gear set aside of 30 metric tons, and also important to note that there is a research set aside that at least was recommended by the council back in September of 3% for 2021, but that for 2022 and 2023, that is currently set at 0. So that's on the next slide, sorry. So in terms of, sorry, next slide. In terms of how the sub-ACL is divided up for the fishing season, in October, based off of those specifications that the New England Council set, the board set the seasonal allocations for this fishing season in 2021 with 72.8% of the sub-ACL available from June through September and 27.2% allocated from October through December. So for board action for consideration today, next slide, thank you. The board can consider approving the Atlantic Herring specifications for these 3 years as recommended by the council, contingent on a final rule being published by NOAA Fisheries. So with that, I will take any questions. Thank you.
Are there any questions for Kirby from the board?
I see no hands raised.
Okay, is there any questions for Kirby from the public?
No hands.
Thank you.
Cherie, if you're talking, you're on mute.
Thank you.
Yep.
So I'd like to ask the board if there are any members that would like to make a motion to set the 2021 to 2023 sub-ACL specification pending release of the proposed rule by NOAA Fisheries.
We have Megan Ware and Dennis Abbott with their hands up.
Okay, I will go with Megan first.
Hi, Madam Chair. I'm happy to make that motion, and I think the language that Kirby had on his second to last slide would be a perfect motion if that can be put on the screen for, or
Okay.
this one.
Thank you, Megan. Dennis, was this also going to be your
Yes, and I'll
motion?
second
Okay.
the motion. And I was wondering in the previous slide if that was the last herring.
Say that again, Dennis. If the previous slide, what?
Was the last herring in the world.
Oh. All right, Megan, would you like to read off the motion?
Sure. Move to approve the following Atlantic herring specifications for 2021 through 2023 as recommended by the New England Fishery Management Council, contingent on the final rule being published by NOAA Fisheries. For 2021, annual catch limit equal to 4,814 metric tons, domestic annual harvest equal to 4,814 metric tons, border transfer equals 0. Area 1A sub-ACL, 1,391 metric tons. Area 1B sub-ACL, 207 metric tons. Area 2 sub-ACL, 1,338 metric tons. Area 3 sub-ACL, 1,877 metric tons. Fixed gear set aside, 30 metric tons. Research set aside as a percent of the sub-ACL, 3%. And then for 2022 and 2023, annual catch limit, 4,098 metric tons. Domestic annual harvest, 4,098 metric tons. Border transfer, 0 metric tons. Area 1A sub-ACL, 1,184 metric tons. Area 1B sub-ACL, 176 metric tons. Area 2 sub-ACL, 1,139 metric tons. Area 3 sub-ACL, 1,598 metric tons. Fixed gear set aside, 30 metric tons. Research set aside as a percent of the sub-ACL, 0%.
Thank you, Megan. So the motion as read by Ms. Ware and Mr. Abbott has seconded that motion. Is there any discussion among the board members?
There are no hands raised. Oh, hold on. Let me make sure I'm in the wrong spot. Sorry. Wrong. Oh, come on. There's still no hands raised.
Thank you. Is there any comments from the public?
I see no hands raised.
Thank you, Tony. So, is there any opposition to this motion from the board members?
I see no hands raised.
Thank you. So the motion is passed by consent unanimously. The next agenda item is an update on Amendment 8, and we want to consider the impacts to the Area 1A fishery. Amendment 8 was initiated by the Council in 2014. It specifies changes to the Atlantic herring management, including the establishment of a long-term acceptable biological catch control rule and the prohibition of midwater trawl gear inshore of 12 nautical miles from Canada to Connecticut and inshore of 20 nautical miles off the east coast of Cape Cod. NOAA Fisheries recently published a final rule on the amendment with the effective date going on February 10th, 2021. Again, this is in your briefing materials. So Kirby, if you can give us an update, please.
Absolutely. Thank you, Chair Patterson. So, as mentioned, here's a presentation just giving you all a brief update on Amendment 8. Next slide, please. So, to review background, the New England Fishery Management Council initiated Amendment 8 in 2015 with the document's purpose being to establish, first off, a long-term acceptable biological catch control rule for Atlantic herring that explicitly accounts for herring's role in the ecosystem. And the second important part of this amendment is to address the biological and ecological requirements of Atlantic herring. And specific to this second item, the document's intent was to, as Cherie mentioned, to address potential localized depletion and user group conflict, excuse me. I will explain this further later on, but the amendment addresses this through implementing an inshore midwater trawl restricted area. And as mentioned, the final environmental impact statement was approved by the Council in 2018, and NOAA Fisheries published a final rule last month with an effective date of February 10th, 2021. So in terms of the ABC control rule, when the biomass is greater than 50% of spawning stock biomass over spawning stock biomass MSY, the maximum fishing mortality rate allowed is 80% of FMSY. So 20% of FMSY is left explicitly for herring predators. Under this policy, as the biomass declines, fishing mortality declines linearly. And if biomass falls below 10% of SSB over SSB MSY, then the ABC is set to 0 with no fishery allocation. And the control rule sets the ABC for a 3-year period, but allows the ABC to vary year to year in response to projected changes in biomass. Next slide. So, as mentioned, the goal of the restricted area is to minimize local depletion. The midwater trawl gear was the target of the restriction because they are more mobile and capable of fishing in offshore areas, unlike other gear types, such as purse seine or fixed gear. And the main focus was on the associated user group conflicts between midwater trawls versus pretty much everyone else, in particular predator fisheries in the Gulf of Maine in southern New England, as well as ecotourism and the tuna fishery that takes place in Area 1A during the fall. So the midwater trawl restricted area is inshore of 12 nautical miles from the US-Canadian border to the Rhode Island-Connecticut border, and inshore of 20 nautical miles off the east coast of Cape Cod. And vessels are able to transit through this area, but gear must be stowed. Now, there is an exception to this where permitted vessels fishing under the Research Set-Aside program with an exempted fishing permit are allowed to fish in this area. As noted, up to 3% was recommended by the council to be set aside for those types of gears to be able to fish under the RSA, and in turn, there could be midwater trawl vessels that fish under that this year potentially. And the only other thing I wanted to remind the board of is that there is a prohibition of midwater gear in Area 1A from June 1st through September 30th. Access starts to this gear type starting October 1st. So next slide, please. This slide shows the restricted area relative to the management areas. Ahead of this meeting, staff reached out to the states of Maine, New Hampshire, Massachusetts and Rhode Island regarding the potential impacts of this rule change on their state-only permitted midwater trawl vessels. Maine and New Hampshire do not allow midwater trawling in state waters. And Massachusetts, while not having an explicit ban, does not foresee any issues or loopholes with state-only permitted vessels fishing in this area, as it's previously been a rare occurrence. Rhode Island is in the process of implementing a midwater trawl prohibition in state waters for non-federally permitted vessels through their regulatory process. So with that, that concludes my presentation, and I'll take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Kirby. Is there any questions from the board?
I do not see any hands raised.
Thank you. Are there any questions from the public?
No hands are raised.
Okay, well, let's move on to the next agenda item on updating us on the New England Fishery Management Council and Commission coordination discussions. So these discussions were initiated due to concerns raised in recent years that management alternatives considered by the commission may have been inconsistent with the federal Atlantic Herring FMP and council comments on specific measures. And they may not have been taken into appropriate consideration by the commission. So a technical work group of the commission plan review team and council plan development team members that was co-chaired by the commission herring board and the council herring committee chairs met in 2020 to discuss a proposed list of these shared management responsibilities for review by the leadership. So this is an update on those discussions at the leadership level. Bob, would you like to hop on?
Yep, I'll give it a shot, Madam Chair, if that's okay. And I very much realize this is the last agenda item on a long day, so I'll go very quickly. I think the background that Sheree provided was great. You know, just as additional background, the membership of the leadership group is the chair and vice chair and executive directors of New England Council and ASMFC. And as Sheree said, you know, the idea is to improve coordination and address some of the jurisdictional concerns that have been coming up, and review the division of labor, is what I call it, document that the technical working group pulled together. The group held a couple calls and ultimately ended up with a number of legal questions about how the Magnuson-Stevens Act and the Atlantic Coastal Act interacted, and the responsibilities and abilities of the state and federal government to work together. So the leadership group asked Tom Neese and I, as the two executive directors, to meet with Chip Lynch and Mitch McDonald, two of the attorneys from the regional office, and talk through the provisions of the Magnuson-Stevens Act and the Atlantic Coastal Act, and how those two laws interacted and overlapped, and where there was, you know, clear direction, and where there was some room to operate. And a number of areas, there are very sort of what we are calling clear and bright lines between the law that, you know, prohibited certain things from occurring in federal waters if they were mandated through interstate FMP. And however, you know, there were, you know, for example, you know, states cannot implement management measures that undermined a federal FMP. However, the states could implement measures that complemented a federal FMP, even if those measures extended out into federal waters. There seemed to be ability to work there. So, you know, there is a little bit of you know, interpretation there, what complements and what undermines the federal plan. And, you know, while there is some guidance about undermining federal authorities, there's still some room for discussion between the leadership group, or that the leadership group still needs to have. So the leadership group has not met following the call that I had with Tom Neese and the two attorneys. That call took place a couple months ago. We just haven't gotten back together as a leadership group. So we will get back together hopefully sooner rather than later, and talk through the division of responsibilities, and really, if the leadership group working with the membership of the commission and council can come up with what they want this bigger herring management program to look like, I think there's ample flexibility in both of the laws to allow the commission and council to implement those provisions. We just have to really, what do we want the coordination to look like, and then kind of go back and see what we can do and what flexibility we do have under the existing laws, because there is some flexibility, but there also is some very clear direction about what the commission can and can't do in federal waters. So the bottom line, Madam Chair, is we need to get the leadership group back together and react to the guidance and input that we got from the attorneys, and then bring something back to the council and commission, hopefully, as I said, sooner rather than later.
Thank you, Bob. Does anybody in the board have further questions for Bob?
I don't have any hands raised, Sheree.
Okay. Thank you again, Bob. Next, I'd like to move on to other business. Before I ask the board members if they have other business, we're going to hear from Kirby on a small presentation of the 2021 New England Fishery Management Council herring work priorities.
Thank you, Chair Patterson. Yeah, I'll be brief with this. My colleague over at the council, Deirdre, she shared this presentation with me, so I'll go through this, and if she's got anything else to add, definitely feel free to chime in, Deirdre. So as outlined on the screen, the 4 main work priorities are to continue development of Framework 7. This is an action to help protect spawning of Atlantic herring on Georges Bank. And the second is to develop rebuilding plan for Atlantic herring because it's been declared overfished. The third is to review and potentially adjust herring accountability measures, and that includes potentially adjusting how the sub-ACL overages are accounted for in the carryover provisions. And then the last one is to coordinate to what Bob was mentioning more with the Commission and the Mid-Atlantic Council. Obviously, the timing is uncertain on these, but issues may be combined into one large action or several separate actions. Next slide. And then in terms of the Framework 7, just so the board has a little bit more understanding of what this is proposing, there's a number of alternatives under consideration right now. They range from no action, so no closures on Georges Bank, to spawning closures that included a 2-area option, a 2-season option, 6 and 8 weeks, and then options for which vessels are restricted, still under development. So this may include different types of vessels by gear type. And it's reviewing the measures adopted to evaluate their effectiveness. This is an effort to try to determine how effective some previous spawning protections have been around these areas. And the last is a spawning tolerance, where between 10 to 30% allowance of landed herring in spawning condition. This would be similar to the GSI program and that the Commission used in the early 2000s. So with that, I will take any questions, or if Deirdre has anything else to add.
Deirdre, do you have anything else you'd like to add?
No, all set. Great job, Kirby.
Thank you. Is there any questions from the board members for Kirby?
I don't see any hands raised, Sheree.
Thank you. Is there other business that the board members would like to bring forward?
I have Dennis Abbott.
Go ahead, Dennis.
Thank you, Madam Chairperson. It's kind of early to be thinking about it, but probably a question more directed towards Maine. we're going to have the sum total of about 1,000 tons available in the first segment of our trimester, or however it's going to be. Is it too early to start thinking about how we're going to limit the fishery as to days and when and whatever? Because are we going to be having meetings every couple of days because we're approaching our limit? It's going to be, I think, more difficult this year as the quota keeps going down, down, down. I don't know if Megan had any thoughts, but I understand it's early.
I
Sheree, you
agree.
have Megan with her hand up.
Yeah, I agree, Dennis. It is early. Go ahead, Megan.
Thank you. Hi, Dennis. Yeah, I haven't given it too much thought yet, to be honest, but I agree it's going to be really challenging this year because I think you're right. I think we're going to be bumping up against the limits really quickly. So I need to think more about what that means, both in trip limits and days out. But yeah, it will be very challenging.
Madam Chair, would you want to have some days out calls earlier because of this challenge, or is our normal schedule, will that work for you all?
So the normal schedule is June? Is that correct?
We usually have the first one more April,
April?
towards the end usually, but sometime in April.
Well, that gets us past the whale concerns that we all have to focus on for a while. Megan, are you opposed to having the meeting in April? Will that give you time?
I think April's fine. I'm fine with our normal schedule. Unfortunately, I don't think there's any like rabbit tricks or rabbit out of the hat tricks we're going to pull out on this one. I think it's just a really tough situation, and yeah, I don't think there are any miracles that I'm foreseeing.
Dan, did you want to weigh in from Mass?
I think April is fine.
Okay, we'll start with organizing a meeting in April, Tony.
Thank you. Will do.
Is there any other business being brought before the board?
Motion to adjourn.
There you go.
There's-
No hands were raised.
Thank you. Is there a second to the motion?
Ray King.
Meeting is adjourned. Thank you, everybody. Have a good evening.